Welcome to Coastal Matters. This is a monthly show produced by the Nantucket Coastal Conservancy in association with Nantucket Community Television. I'm Charlie Walters, and my guest today is Emily Molden, who is the Resource Ecologist for the Nantucket Land Council. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me, Charlie.
Before we get to what you do, why don't you tell us what the Nantucket Land Council is?
Sure. The Nantucket Land Council is a nonprofit organization, and it was initially started in the 1970s, really as a result of and a breakoff from the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, which was established about 10 years prior. And the Conservation Foundation was really concerned about obtaining ownership of open space and protecting property outright. And there was a building need for someone or some group to get a little bit more involved in environmental issues on the island. So the Land Council was created really to fill that advocacy role. And some of our earliest work was really in the land courts, trying to obtain title to the old sheep commons. There were a lot of developers that were obtaining title to them and developing them. And so we were spending a lot of time in land courts fighting those developers to try to get that property and protect it for open space. So we did a lot of that work and then would transfer those lands to the Conservation Foundation and the Land Bank. So those were the early days, and then it was probably 10 years later or so when we started to hold conservation restrictions and get into more of the land trust business and branched out from there. But advocacy was really at our roots.
So there's a lot of land here, or some amount, maybe you can tell me, that you did own at one time, but you no longer own.
Yes.
How much land are we talking about here?
I don't think I could even tell you. There's a lot of land out in the Squam area, Matacasham Valley, Surfside. There were a lot of different areas of the island that we were working in, and I'm sure the details of it are in our file boxes somewhere in the office, but I couldn't tell you how much.
How much do you think you own right now as we speak?
Well, so the Land Council doesn't really own property outright. What we do is we operate with something called a conservation restriction, which is a different kind of open space protection. And the property owner maintains ownership of the property, but they give up certain rights, often development rights, to their property in order to protect the conservation values long term. And so in doing so, it will often change the valuation of their property, and there can be some tax benefits for that. It's often useful with estate planning as well, and it just helps people to protect their property permanently if they choose to do so.
And where are some of those holdings?
Those are all over the island. We have about 1,600 acres protected, a little more than that, and there's quite a number of them. We also have a number of restrictions on the island of Tuckernuck, and we also protect all of Muskeget with conservation restrictions as well.
We'll get back to Muskeget in a few minutes, but tell me what you do as Resource Ecologist.
So as Resource Ecologist, I have a number of responsibilities. We're a small staff, there's only 3 of us, and so things get spread around quite a bit. I spend part of my time as an educator. I do a lot of work in the local schools with environmental education programs and also with the community. I also am involved in some research, water quality research, invasive species and rare plant research. And then I also play an advocacy role. Part of what we do is, as advocates and as sort of a watchdog environmental group, is we attend a lot of the town meetings and regulatory meetings to monitor development proposals and sort of try to provide a voice, really, for the natural resources and for the environment.
Is there a typical day at your job? It sounds though there probably is not.
No, there's no typical day at my job. Every day is different. That's one thing that I really love about it. I'm able to work in all of these different aspects of the sciences, from education and research to policy. So it really, no, there definitely is not a typical day.
Getting back to the properties that there are restrictions on, how often is somebody there doing a project on those properties? Or is that going to vary from year to year?
Well, we really don't do much on the properties. The purpose of the restriction is really to protect and maintain the conservation values of the property. So every restriction is different, and they're drafted and written based on the goals of the property owner. Sometimes there are building envelopes that are carved out of the restriction so that they have an ability to build a home there in the future, but then a large portion of the property will be protected. And because it is still private property, technically, we are usually only out there on an annual basis to do an inspection to make sure that none of the conditions of the restriction have been violated and that the conservation values are being maintained. And there's a bit of a process to go through to have a restriction approved. It has to be approved locally by the Board of Selectmen and also by the state before it can be recorded. So,
let's say there's a piece of land that has more and more scrub oak from year to year. Is it the owner's responsibility or decision to, say, cut back the scrub oak, or is it the land councils, and who would do that if it was going to be done?
Sure. So really it's the property owner's decision. There are some instances where we are given restrictions as mitigation through the state natural heritage program. If there's a development that's going on a property that has rare species habitat, sometimes the state will require as mitigation for that development that the property owner put a conservation restriction on a portion of the property. And sometimes that will include some kind of habitat management plan for the species that are being protected. And in those instances, then it's still the property owner's responsibility, but they would maybe take care of the management in conjunction with the state. And we would be there sort of as a liaison to do the inspections of the property. We do try, when we go out to our properties, to always make recommendations to the property owner if there are management issues that we think should be addressed, and we'll work with them on those. So, for example, if there's an infestation of an invasive species that we are concerned is going to spread and impact the conservation values of the property, then we'll bring that to the landowner's attention and try to work with them on how they might want to move forward with managing it. But we're not doing any active management on their property. We're really just overseeing the perpetual longevity of the conservation values that are being protected through the restriction.
I was looking at a map today before we did the show, and there's a parcel of land that either you own or there's a conservation restriction. I'm not sure which. And it's at the western end of the moors. It's a long, narrow piece of land. It's maybe half a mile north of the second or third milestone. And it seems to be more or less surrounded by land bank land. Now, in a case like that where you've got abutters with similar interests, is it routine to work with those people? Because otherwise it's like trying to get rid of the mosquitoes on the beach and not on the next beach.
Sure.
Do you know the piece I'm talking about? I think I've got the location right, but maybe not.
I'm not exactly sure of the piece you're talking about. There are a number of properties in that area that we have restrictions on, maybe around Tetokimo or somewhere in there.
Yes, it is around there.
Where we do have a conservation restriction, which was part of that development initially when it went in. And yes, we do end up working closely with the land bank and the Conservation Foundation if they have abutting properties. Land management is one of many things that is challenging to do in a piecemeal way. It certainly makes a lot more sense to be in partnership with your abutters, especially when you have similar goals like we do. The land bank, as you know, is the organization that's quasi-governmental and that does get their funding through the real estate transfer tax, and they use that to further their mission of purchasing and protecting open space for recreation and such.
But the Nantucket Land Council is a private organization. It is not funded by the town in any way or form. Exactly.
We're a private nonprofit, so we have a membership. We're a membership-supported organization, essentially. So we are entirely private.
When you personally are on a land council property, give us some specifics of what sorts of things you would do on a given day.
Well, I don't spend a lot of time, again, out on our conservation restriction properties because we tend to really just be there to do the inspections on an annual basis. So we'll go out in the springtime and inspect all of our Nantucket restrictions, and then in the fall we typically spend a day on Tuckernuck inspecting those properties. But outside of the inspections and any specific requests from homeowners, we typically don't visit our properties very often at all.
How did you come to Nantucket?
I came to Nantucket actually via Tuckernuck. I spent 2 summers working as a shorebird monitor and an educator on Tuckernuck Island through the Tuckernuck Land Trust, which was initially formed as an offshoot of the Nantucket Land Council. So I spent 2003 and 2004 on Tuckernuck working for them, and then it was at the end of 2004 that I ended up moving to Nantucket full-time to work for the Land Council.
Now you say you were on Tuckernuck 2003, 2004. Were you there year-round?
No, I was not. I was just there for the summer. I was there from about Memorial Day to Labor Day. And they have subsequently had a shorebird monitor there every summer since to take care of the shorebird monitoring and also to provide educational opportunities for the residents and visitors of Tuckernuck.
What was your educational background that led you to be the right person to do that?
I was a biology student at the University of Vermont, and after graduating, I spent some time working for the Vermont Institute of Natural Science and a few other field positions. And I was kind of looking for exposure in a different environment. I had spent some time studying alpine butterflies out in southwestern Colorado and time in Vermont in the mountains, and I found an advertisement for the Tuckernuck position on ecojobs.com, and I thought, I haven't spent much time at the beach. Maybe that would be a good place to go. And that's how I found myself on Tuckernuck.
And then at some point you found yourself on Muskeget, and I want to hear a lot about that.
I did find myself on Muskeget. There's an ornithologist who grew up and now has a house on Tuckernuck, Dick Veet, and I spent a lot of time working with him during the summer. And in the spring of 2004, April and May, I spent those 2 months with one other woman and a Sheltie over on Muskeget. We were doing some bird research for Dick Veet and another ornithologist.
And this is 24 hours a day we're talking about.
Oh yes, we were there. I think I told you before the show, we may have left 3 times during those 2 months, but otherwise we were living on Muskeget, and it was quite cold. We spent a lot of time in our sleeping bags. But essentially what we were there to do was to maintain an area, a breeding ground for the roseate terns, which is a federally listed species, if it were to choose to nest there that summer. But one of the problems is that Muskeget over the years has become much more covered with gulls nesting, and the gulls tend to settle down and build their nests before the terns arrive. So one of our big responsibilities really was to keep a designated area clear of gulls for the terns. So we spent a lot of time chasing gulls out of that area, which was what the dog was for, actually. And we also did a lot of other avian surveys while we were out there, seabird surveys as well. It was a long 2 months, but it was fantastic. I would never trade it for anything else.
This is fascinating. I've lived here for decades and never met anyone who actually lived on Muskeget for any amount of time.
Well, it was a funny year because I spent those 2 months on Muskeget, and then I spent the summer on Tuckernuck, and then it was that fall when I finally moved to Nantucket. So
You moved to the big city.
I progressively made my way along the island chain, yes.
The council does not own any shorefront property. This show is about the coastline, but tell us how what happens away from the beach affects what happens on the beach.
Well, I think that there are a lot of ways that what happens inland affects the coastline. When you're talking about the harbors, then certainly water quality is a factor, and the land use practices that we have upland and on the main island have a huge impact within the watershed of what's going on in the harbors. And so if there's an opportunity for us to protect a piece of property within the harbor watershed with a conservation restriction to limit the development and some of the other land use practices that can affect water quality, then we definitely will see that as a huge public benefit just to help our harbors out.
Now, how does that work? Let's say there's a proposed construction project a half a mile away from any point of water, whether it's harbor or ocean. What sorts of things can happen to harm the shoreline or the ocean or the harbor or a pond?
Well, when it comes to water quality issues, the direct connection of our groundwater and aquifer to those water bodies is really what links the land to the water. So anything that's going on, whether it is the installation of a septic system or the landscaping and fertilizer use on the property, or poor erosion control, if you're talking about being directly adjacent to the water body, then those things can certainly have an effect on the water. Anything that leaches down through our sandy soils and gets into the groundwater will eventually make its way to whatever water source is down gradient from it, be it a pond or a harbor.
So it doesn't stay completely local. I mean, if you're at the furthest point from a body of water and you dump a toxic substance in your backyard, it's going to get in the water table and or a pond and or the harbor or the ocean. It's all connected.
Exactly. It's all connected. Nantucket has what's called a Sole-Source Aquifer, which the EPA designated in the 70s, which essentially just means that they made an official determination that if we get all of our drinking water from the ground, and it is all connected to the ponds and the harbor and ocean, and if anything were to happen to contaminate that drinking water source, then there's no other alternative basically for us to get our water supply from. And so you're right, it is all connected, and it's not only connected to the ponds and the harbors, but it's also really important because it's our drinking water too.
I haven't been to that many Conservation Commission meetings over the years, but I think every time I've been to one, you've been there.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Sure. So part of my role with the Land Council and our role as a watchdog and an advocate on the island is I attend all of the Conservation Commission meetings. So I generally, through the weeks leading up to the meeting, will go to the office or via the internet review all of the upcoming proposals to the CONCOM. And any of those proposals that are either going to require a waiver or I'm concerned may have some adverse impact on the adjacent resource areas, I will provide comments to the Conservation Commission on. Sometimes I'll write a letter with my concerns or recommendations to get them in the file and to alert the Commission of them. And I'll also make comments at the hearing directly to the Commission if I have concerns about a project. And sometimes, because we're just a small staff with limited expertise, if there's an issue we are really concerned about, we will hire outside consultants to help us do further review on a specific project. And that's one of the things that's beneficial about having a small staff. We can sort of use our budget and our resources to bring in expertise from outside to help us on specific issues.
And those CONCOM meetings are open to the public. I mean, anybody can go.
Yes, they are open to the public, and a majority of the applications, all of the larger projects that have filed a notice of intent for a permit, then they have a public hearing component to them. So if there's an abutter or someone who's interested in what's going on, the Commission always makes sure that there's an opportunity for the public to either ask questions for clarification or just state their concerns or opposition to the project if they have it, as far as it relates to the wetland protection regulations.
In all the years you've been here, I'm curious, what do you see as the biggest problems and the biggest victories, really? Let's start with the biggest problems you see at this point, the biggest threats to Nantucket shoreline.
The biggest threats to Nantucket shoreline, I would say absolutely erosion is on top, and also water quality, I think. And erosion is a threat because it threatens the shorelines as we know them now, but I think it's also a threat because of our response to it and the implications that that could have to the shorelines themselves. And then water quality is also a concern, I think, development. And I'm sure there are plenty more, but.
Let's go to the opposite side. In your time here, what are the biggest victories Nantucket has had in trying to protect its shoreline?
I think education is a huge one, and over the years with some of the higher profile projects and some of the, I think whenever Nantucket in its history has had a large storm where there's been massive erosion events, then it sort of opens people's eyes again to the issue. I mean, we tend to not pay a lot of attention to things until they're really staring us in the face. And I think when those kind of bigger events happen, then it brings people's attention to it. So I think over the years there's been a lot more education and raising of awareness of the issue, and I see the community in different ways responding to that and trying to figure out how to address it. And there have been some great steps. The Coastal Management Plan Work Group that was starting to look at some of those issues, at least as they relate to town-owned property. There have also been some really great workshops put on. I think Nantucket Coastal Conservancy has done a few, and other community organizations to bring experts from off-island, on-island. And I just think that the more the community can discuss the issue and work together and continue to discuss it, then the better off we are going into the future as far as recognizing what our options are and what's going to work best for the community and our coastlines here. So, yeah, I think raising the education and awareness has certainly been a victory.
You were involved in the Coastal Management Plan.
I was the secretary for the Coastal Management Plan Work Group. So I ended up writing a lot.
You talked about it indirectly just now, but can you say a bit more about that process?
Sure. So it was a long process, and I think because it really hasn't been done much anywhere else, there was maybe one or two other towns that have begun the process or started to tackle the development of an actual plan, that we didn't really have a lot of guidance or example to follow. We had a lot of help from the state department, the Coastal Zone Management Department, which was very helpful. They came out to visit and to provide some guidance to us. But we were asked by the selectmen who appointed us to draft a management plan of the town-owned coastal properties, to look at infrastructure needs and concerns and to develop some action items. And there were a whole list of goals that we were given at the outset. And we spent about 2 years meeting and trying to draft a rough plan for the town-owned properties, which was an interesting process. We were, I think, a really good, well-rounded cross-section of the community that had different interests, sometimes conflicting interests, but I think that that's really important in trying to find a balance. So there were times where it was challenging to come to some sort of consensus and agreement on things, and then there were other times where I think we were all able to get behind the most important aspects and points and accomplish some goals. So I hope that the town continues to look at that plan. There are some action items that I think are going to be really important moving forward. One that comes to mind is, I think we had recommended that the town develop or write a vulnerability study for the island to get a work group to sit down and figure out what the town's main concerns are as far as infrastructure and prioritize them and start to develop either trigger points for dealing with them and or recommendations and ideas of how they should be addressed. And that's something that we didn't really have time to specifically tackle, but I hope that the town moves forward with doing that. I think that will be really important. And again, having some way to continue the dialogue about what the issues are and how to deal with them, because hindsight's always 20/20, but I think we can learn a lot from other communities, and there's a lot of knowledgeable people on the island.
Well, as you say, the plan as currently existing covers only town-owned land, which is a small percentage of the island's coastline. Do you foresee a time ever when there'll be a plan that would encompass all of the shoreline, public and private? I know that's not an easy task.
No, it's not an easy task. I think that it would be a lot more productive to look at the island that way. I think that, again, this was a good step to try to get the community and the town talking about the issues more and focused on them in some meaningful way. But as I'm sure you've heard from other guests and countless times, erosion control is also something that is just really difficult to deal with piecemeal. And unfortunately, by not looking at the island as a whole and the island coastline as a whole, the default is that it's being regulated lot by lot, because that's the only other way it's going to happen. So as a property owner has a concern and brings it to the Conservation Commission in the state to somehow manage their coastline, whether it's with a hard structure or a softer structure, it's being regulated in a piecemeal fashion. And a lot of the coastal management, because it's such a dynamic system, affects areas far beyond property boundaries. So whether or not we'll ever get to that point, I don't really see it happening anytime soon, but I hope that there are community members that continue to push for it, because I think it would be a much more productive way to approach the issue.
Is it fair to say that the current plan is better than no plan?
I definitely think that's fair to say. Yes.
Emily Molden, thanks very much for joining me today. I
Thanks
appreciate
so much,
it.
Charlie. Absolutely.
For Coastal Matters, I'm Charlie Walters. Thanks for joining us. Please tune in again next time.